Thank you. Thank you so much. Africa, as we think of today, the different countries, when the countries were being designed, no one who looked like me and Ofebia were there. And so, and so what we call Ghana and what we call Nigeria, this is how it happened. I'm telling you. Some guy like that said, I like this, and that's how the border came. Right? But prior to these folks drawing us up, we were actually trading among each other. There was a lot of Pan-African trade. And so when I hear this idea that Pan-Africanism doesn't make sense, I say, what are we talking about? Aliko Dangote, Africa's richest man, who's worth over $20 billion, he should give me 1 or 2%. We talk about him, but what people don't realize is Aliko's grandfather was the wealthiest man in West Africa. He had a peanut empire that traded all across the West, all through to the East Africa. So prior to the colonial times, we already had a history of trading among ourselves. And as was mentioned yesterday, the fragmentation of the states, with Equatorial Guinea and 1 million, with Liberia and Sierra Leone together is barely 10 million. The fragmentation will not allow us to compete at a global level. We necessarily have to come together, because together we're a market of 1 billion people. And then we can compete. And when people say we have over 2,000 languages, and have you been to Europe? What connects Prague and London? Right? If Europe can do it, so can we. And might I remind you, Kwame Nkrumah came up with the idea way before the EU did. So, you see Paul. But the good thing is, now I don't have to talk a lot, because Paul has told you a lot about this. I remember when this came out. I was 13 years old. I had this tradition with my dad. On the way to school, he would buy newspapers and magazines from the street hawkers. And we had a deal. There was traffic. Traffic would be about an hour. And I had to read the magazine very quickly before I got to school and I gave it back. And my favorite was The Economist. I loved The Economist. Now, at 13, to be honest, it did not win me any cool points among the girls. But it expanded my intellectual horizons. And I remember the day this came out, and pitch black, the man holding the grenade launcher, and the 3 words that would forever haunt me: the hopeless continent. I turned to my father and I said, Papa, why do they think we are hopeless? And in a dramatic reversal 11 years later, there's a boy holding a kite, Africa rising. I mean, what happened in the space of a decade? Was it that, to Paul's point, they were embarrassed and suddenly had to put rainbow colors to say Africa rising? Or were they recognizing the reality at this time that 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world were in sub-Saharan Africa? And when people say Africa rising or the new Africa, I reject that. I call it Africa resurging. Let me give you a little bit of history, pre-colonial history. In 1324, the king of Mali, the Muslim king of Mali, Mansa Musa, went on a pilgrimage to Mecca with a stop in Cairo. 12 years later, the Arab historian Al-Umari went to Cairo and remarked that Mansa Musa had spent so much money in giving gold as gifts that he depressed the price of gold in the region for a very, very long time. I mean, this was a time when the economic actions of African rulers had global consequences. In fact, Mansa Musa had spent so much gold that when Angelino Duquette of Mallorca created a world map in 1339, for the first time ever, Mali showed up on that world map and on subsequent maps. So this idea of Africa rising is when you make our history start from, and then the British came. Yeah. We had a history long before that. In fact, 500 years after Mansa Musa's event, there were some Portuguese traders who came on East Africa. And we actually have evidence from their diaries where they said, we went to, and I'm talking of present-day Tanzania and Zanzibar. They said, look, we went there and we met these merchants who had houses like we have in Portugal and Spain, who are flourishing and rich and trading in all these different goods. And they wrote, and I quote, "And these were black men." And so we've had this history that I think is bigger and larger than just, colonial times to present. Now, when we talk, my talk is supposed to be on the drivers of economic growth. And I think Paul is right in that a lot of our growth has been tied to commodities, natural resources. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. And I think we'll continue to grow due to this. Why? Look at Chile. Chile gets most of its earnings from copper. Yet you don't see what's happening in Zambia happening to Chile. Because Chile has been successful in using the right type of policies to harness the economic growth. Chile has a rule. They don't run budget deficits. So they actually have a board that sets a long-term price of copper. If copper goes up, they collect the savings and put it in a stabilization fund. So the problem isn't that we have commodities. The problem is our policies governing these commodities. After all, God has blessed us. We have a third of the world's mineral reserves. Known reserves. Paul Collier at the University of Oxford, author of The Plundered Planet, revealed that in OECD countries, even after 200 years of intense extraction, the average square kilometer has $114,000 of known subsoil assets. In sub-Saharan Africa, the equivalent is $23,000. And yet we have a third of known mineral reserves. And the difference is because we just don't know. And that's why the map Paul showed us earlier of all these discoveries happening. So if you take $23,000 and $140,000, it seems to suggest that there's a huge multiple on known reserves that could happen. And so for me, we need to embrace and be proud of these resources we have. The issue is, how do you manage it in an effective way, and how do you have the right type of policies? But I believe that we're going to continue to have growth driven by natural resources, which we're endowed with. Next, telcos. A lot of our growth has been driven by telcos. This is Sudanese billionaire Mo Ibrahim. When Mo started Celtel in the 90s, people thought he was crazy. They said, "You want to sell cell phones to those poor Africans? Are you mad?" In fact, his thesis was so contrarian that some countries gave him the license for free. I'm telling you. I'm still looking for countries who will give me a free license. When Mo built and sold Celtel in 2006, he sold it for $4 billion. Again, if you see Mo, tell him I'll take some. Celtel, again, defying those who says you can't build a Pan-African business. 14 African countries, 24 million subscribers at the time of sale. That's what he was able to do. And we know already what the mobile revolution has unleashed on the continent. 1 billion subscribers. M-Pesa, as you learned about yesterday. Telcos, I think, has been driving the continent. And while you're not going to see the same growth in terms of subscriber growth, you are going to see a platform that the mobile revolution has created that would be used to spur on new innovation. And I'll go into some of that. Next, financial services has been huge. A lot of the growth has been powered also. A lot of the GDP growth has been powered by growth in financial services. In banking, when I was growing up, we only had 1 or 2, 3 banks in Ghana. And now you go to Ghana, and every block there's a different bank. We have over 25 different banks. And yet, in spite of how banking and financial services have flourished, only 20% of Africa is banked. It's remarkable. And that's where the mobile infrastructure has some very interesting things for us. So banking, financial services, I think, is going to continue to also be a growth area, but differently. We have to figure out new ways. How do we get to that 80%? And then retail. Retail. You go, retail, the growth of retailers has been extraordinary. ShopRite, for the last decade or so has been expanding across Africa, has been growing top line, 30+%, and return on invested capital of about 40%. It's been extraordinary. And you see that everywhere you go. You see the proliferation of malls, right? Some people dispute how big is the middle class, how do you define the middle class. The one thing you can't dispute is we are spending money. We are spending money. And we have a problem with how we collect our data. Africa is complicated, it's complex, but the poverty is real. No one can come and dispute that we still don't have those issues. But I think for too long, because we haven't gotten the right type of data, we've also understated the wealth on the continent. And we've understated a lot of the consumption patterns because we don't actually have the real type of data on the ground. That's why I go on the ground a lot. I've now been to 43 African countries, interviewed over 600 entrepreneurs for a book I'm writing on young entrepreneurs across Africa. And when you go on the continent and you travel to all these different places, you learn so much on the ground. You realize that there is, what you read in the papers and what you see on TV is very different from when you're actually on the ground interacting with people. And yes, the continent is diverse, it is vast, it's massive. Geographically, you can fit the US, Western Europe, India, and China, and Africa, and there'll still be space. It's huge. But there is still this, someone in a question yesterday spoke about this African sensibility. It is there. There's still, in all my travels throughout the continent, I've been embraced by people everywhere who, whilst they recognize that, yes, I'm from Tanzania, I'm from Kenya, I'm from even Mauritania. I was in Mauritania, and I was embraced. They said, come here, my African brother. And part of that comes from our shared history. Part of that comes from the shared issues we all face. That brings us together. And I would argue we probably have a better, if again, I point to the EU. France and the UK, didn't you people fight for 100 years? There was a 100-year war. If Europe, after the 100-year war, they can come together and think of themselves as one Europe, I think we even have better grounds to think of ourselves as Africa. Now, a lot of the caution that Paul discussed, you are seeing that happen a lot now. These are the headlines. The China slowdown, commodity prices down, and people are starting to question, Africa rising, I call Africa rising, is it hype? Is it real? Is the continent really going to grow and transform? Or was this just due to high oil prices? It's a big question mark. In my perspective as an entrepreneur, I've spent the last 10 years investing and building businesses across the continent. And I think that I've already considered that natural resources will play a part, commodities will play a part. But I think there is a change from a standpoint of entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs that are transforming the continent. And there are certain trends where the train is moving towards economic transformation in ways that I'll go over and discuss. Part of that, and you guys should be familiar with this cover by now, hinges on this middle class that Paul alluded to. Africa, aspiring Africa. Now, I always say that whether or not you care about Africa, you care. Because in 2050, 1 in 4 of the world will be there. So when a quarter of the world's population is in Africa, you'll be forced to care about Africa. And that's something that's undeniable. That's something that is, I think, if it's managed well, will be a tremendous asset to us. We will be not just one of the largest populations, the largest continental population in the world, we'll also have the largest youth force, where 70% of the world's youth will be on the continent. And this is not 2,500. It's 2050. It's in 34 years' time, right? And so when you think of the projection, the demographics, and where the consumer economy is going, for me, it gives me a lot of optimism. Paul spoke about this urbanization. I've seen that urbanization. I saw it from when I was growing up to now. And what's incredible about the urbanization is, look at the figure of cities with more than 1 million people. We have as many cities with a population of 1 million people as Europe, and more than India. And when you look at, what's happened in China and Latin America, what happened once cities reach above the population of 1 million, you generally saw an acceleration in development. And so I think I am part of the school of thought who believes that urbanization is actually going to lead to acceleration in our growth, of course. And I want to show you this in pictures. This is Accra Airport. This picture was taken only about 15 years ago. I remember this road very well, okay? I was stuck in traffic here all the time. This left goes to the airport. When you go down here and you turn around here, my school is here, the school I went to. And down this road, there's a spot over here called Poki House. They have the best akonfem in Ghana. Akonfem is guinea fowl. If you ever go there, you have to try it. Tell them I sent you. You might get a discount. I mean, I pass this road every day going to school, coming back. Take a good look at it, too. This picture was taken last year. Same place. Uh-huh. So what are you talking about when you tell me you are not sure Africa is developing? Same place. And you see this not just in Accra. You go to Lusaka, you go to Nairobi, you go to many cities across the continent, and this is the transformation you are seeing on the ground. Now, let me give you some case studies of some cool companies I've invested in, built up, and worked with that I think give some insight into the possibilities of this new economy that's happening. One is Solo. So Solo it buys into the whole consumer story, right? And isn't this such a beautiful phone? Very nice, very elegant. So you see, Ibrahim is holding a feature phone. Now, even though we have 1 billion subscribers, smartphone penetration on the continent is still only about 10 to 12%, which means you have 800 to 900 million people holding phones like Ibrahim. Ibrahim is upset because he can't check Facebook. He can't go on Twitter. So he's not very happy. He wants to be cool like this guy. He wants a nice phone that he can, go on the internet and do cool stuff with. But the big problem is price. Because the iPhone and Samsung and all that stuff cost, you go to Nigeria, it's about $1,000. It's not like here where, you don't pay the $1,000. You go to the Verizon store, $200, and then you get a contract and you have the phone. They don't do that for us in Africa. They make us pay the full price. And so Solo said, how do I create a phone that targets the African consumer? So they had this beautiful phone, and they said, look, let's make it at a $100 price point, which opens up the market. But then they realized that even at $100, there's still, if the middle class is defined as starts at $2, as Paul told us, that's 50 days for someone to put their $2 for 50 days, right? It's still, it could be prohibitive. So they said, well, if Verizon can do it, so can we. And they're about to launch, in partnership with Airtel, first ever consumer financing scheme on phones to allow you to be able to get a smartphone for $10, right? Which will be launched in Nigeria. Amazing. But then we said, you know what? It's not just about getting a phone. We want to create an experience for the consumer that the consumer will love. We said, shake body, we like music. Africans, we love music. That is the one thing that, as diverse as we are, everywhere I've been. I've probably been to maybe 57 cities across the continent. Every city I've been to, there's music somewhere. We are jamming. That is the one thing that unites us. We love music. And we realized that, look, in Cupertino, I love Tim Cook, but he's not thinking of us when he's making the phone. So this is iTunes. We don't have credit cards. It doesn't work. How are you going to sign up to buy your music? Spotify, they don't think of us. So we said, well, we'll put our own music on the phone. 20 million songs available, including local music. So now people get the phone, and it's not just a phone. It becomes a way for them to listen to music, local and global. But then we said, you know what? People also like watching movies. Nollywood is a $3 billion industry. It is actually the second largest by volume after Bollywood. It's become bigger than Hollywood from a volume perspective. And so when we talk, so whether or not oil is at 100 or oil is at 20, people are still doing Nollywood movies. And that industry continues to grow and continues to add tremendous value to the economy. So we said, well, we initially created the app on the phone to allow you to stream movies. We went and spoke to studios in both Hollywood and locally. And we said, look, why don't we do a deal, put this on the phone so people can watch movies? But we ran into a little problem. The same problem that, by the way, Netflix, which just announced that they're in Africa, is facing. These things. The towers. There's a lot of congestion on the data. If you try to watch a movie on some of the networks, come back next week. I mean, anyone who's tried it knows what I'm talking about. It is so slow, and because the growth of adoption and the growth in data usage on the continent has been huge. Look, internet penetration, we now have 300 million internet users on the continent. 300 million. 50 million Africans are on Facebook. 50 million. And so when you have, so much clogged networks like that, it makes it difficult. So we decided to be innovative because this phone, we're not building it in Europe or in the US or somewhere and coming to dump it. We were designing it from a perspective of how do you solve the needs of the African consumer? So we put in hotspots. These little things, you put them in high traffic areas, and it creates a hotspot. In 2 minutes, you download a full movie. This is the type of innovation that is happening on the continent, similar to what you heard about M-Pesa. Innovation that is localized and that focuses on how do you solve the idiosyncratic needs of the African consumer. Not cut, copy, paste, dump. That won't work. Another is technology, and how technology, I think, is going to transform the continent, especially given the base of mobile phones that we have. This is another one of our portfolio companies called M-Pharma. M-Pharma, Greg Rockson, who's the CEO, was inspired by it. There was a woman who was given, she had a heart condition, and she was given a drug, a prescription. So they went to look for it, because you go to one pharmacy. Do you have this drug? No, you don't. Go to another pharmacy. Do you have this drug? You don't. They went to so many different pharmacies looking for the drug in traffic. By the time they found the drug, she was dead. Isn't that madness? She lost her life because no one knew which pharmacy had the drug. And we didn't have information on the location and availability. So Greg said this is madness. So he started looking into it and realized that only 4 have effective drug monitoring capabilities. And this creates problems because with no data, we cannot do market development. We cannot test the efficacy of drugs. We cannot, doctors cannot be able to understand, compliance. It really hampers our ability to come up with innovative strategies. It also hurts us on pharmacovigilance. Counterfeit drugs, drugs that are not working, all these different issues. You also have a problem with monitoring, right? Doctors want to be able to follow up with patients. They want to be able to understand, are these drugs working, etc. So what we ended up doing, and then we realized that pharma companies also really needed this data. It was important to them. We spoke with them and they said, look, the pharmaceutical industry, pharma spending in Africa, $45 billion market. $45 billion. No one can tell you how many men versus women are buying drugs, age, there's no data. They just know it's 45 billion and it's just been going up. So how do you plan around that? How do you figure out which drugs are working? How do you figure out how to take? I mean, it's a mess without having this kind of data. So we've launched and we're building the largest e-prescription network in Africa. We are currently in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and Zambia, and expanding. And what this does is you get a unique SMS, verify the prescription, and we're actually able to now collect all this data. And what's impressive here is the data is actually able, from the data, we realized that prices were super high. And so people were not buying drugs because prices were high. We're able to take this data and partner with Big Pharma to cut prices by 50%. So it's a win-win. And I'm running out of time, so the last thing quickly is on, I think manufacturing is also going to be a big game changer. And the reason is we don't have a choice, right? With what we've seen with commodity prices, what we've seen with the depreciation of currencies, tied partly to these commodities and the fiscal deficits, is it's become so expensive to buy imported goods that is pushing that, along with a lot of policies across the board, governments going for import substitution policies. There's a push for us to make our own stuff. I mean, we have 60% of the world's available arable land, yet we don't feed ourselves. So this is another portfolio company in Kenya, and we're making baby food because we're going to have 1 billion babies in the next 35 years. Someone has to feed them. And so we're making baby food, right? And you're seeing that we're in Kenya, we're going to open a factory in Nigeria this year. We're going to make baby food because our product costs 100 shillings. The Nestle product costs 600 shillings. Making, in-house manufacturing for ourselves. And finally, I want to end on this slide. And the reason I want to end on this slide is, look, I am amazed by young entrepreneurs across the continent. You've seen some examples of that. Making our own baby food, using technology to solve problems with the drug industry, cut prices. You've seen that on the solo phone, trying to create great experiences for the African consumer. I am committed, and I am a big believer that Africa is going to continue to transform and will defy the odds over the next several decades. However, as much as I've seen all this entrepreneurial energy unleashed on the business world, you cannot out-innovate out of bad governance. In as much as we need great entrepreneurs to transform industries, we also need public entrepreneurs so that what we end up building is an Africa where majority of the economy is owned and controlled by Africans, an economy that can provide jobs for its youth, an economy that can match strong economic growth with broad-based shared economic prosperity, and an economy where everyone in Africa can succeed regardless of your age, regardless of your tribe or ethnicity, regardless of which political party you're affiliated with, and regardless of your gender. And that's the Africa we're hoping we can build. Thank you.